My fiancé announced, "I'm selling your comic book collection. They're just paper. First edition's worth $120,000 including Action Comics #1. I said, "Touch them and I'll prosecute." She sold them anyway. When the collector who bought them contacted me about authenticity, and I involved the FBI for interstate stolen property. I, 34 male, am an IT infrastructure manager who spent the last 31 years building a comic book collection that most people would consider insane, and I consider the single best decision I've ever made. Not insane in a hoarding way. Insane in a this is a carefully curated, climate-controlled, fully insured, CGC-certified archive of American cultural history way. The crown jewel was an Action Comics #1 from 1938. Superman's first appearance. Graded 4.5 by CGC, insured for $85,000 on its own. Around it sat Detective Comics #27, Amazing Fantasy #15, Fantastic Four #1, and about 40 other books that together appraised at $120,000 2 years ago and had been climbing ever since. I had a dedicated room for them, second bedroom of my townhouse, converted into a climate-controlled display space with humidity regulation, temperature locked at 65 degrees Fahrenheit, UV filtering glass on every frame, and a separate insurance rider on my homeowner's policy. I knew the CGC certification number of every single book from memory. My fiancé moved in 8 months before our wedding date. She'd seen the room on our third date and called it adorable. She smiled when I explained what Action Comics #1 meant to the history of popular culture. She said she loved that I was passionate about something. I should have paid way more attention to the word adorable, because that's not how you describe something you respect. That's how you describe something you tolerate until you have the leverage to remove it. The first sign came about 3 months after she moved in. She started casually referring to the collection room as the future nursery in phone calls with her mother, conversations she didn't know I could hear from the hallway. No pregnancy had been discussed. No timeline had been set. I filed it under harmless future planning and kept moving. That was my mistake. The second sign came when she asked me to look up what the collection might sell for, out of curiosity. I told her it wasn't for sale. She laughed and said everything's for sale at the right price, like it was a joke. It wasn't a joke. The third sign, the one I should have treated as a 5-alarm situation, came at dinner with her parents about 6 weeks before the wedding. Her father had made his money flipping commercial real estate and treated every asset on earth as a thing to be liquidated at maximum speed. He leaned across the table and said, "So my daughter tells me you're sitting on $120,000 in comic books." He said it the way you'd say moldy furniture. I told him the number was probably higher now. He smiled and said that sounded like a down payment on a real house. I smiled back and said good thing I already owned a townhouse.
He didn't like that. She didn't either.
I caught a look pass between them, quick, practiced, the kind that comes from previous private conversations I hadn't been part of. My gut tightened, but I told myself I was being paranoid. I was not being paranoid. 2 weeks before the wedding, she walked into the collection room while I was resleeving a near-mint copy of Incredible Hulk #1 and delivered the sentence that blew everything up. "I've been talking to a dealer. He'll take the whole collection. We can use the money for a real house." I already told him we'd have everything ready by Friday. I set the book down carefully and asked her to repeat herself. She repeated herself. I told her to call the dealer and cancel. She told me the room was going to be the nursery and that we'd discussed this. I told her she'd mentioned it to her mother on the phone, and that was not a discussion with me. She dropped the warmth from her voice completely, like a switch, and said they were just paper and ink in a room that should be used for our family. I told her they were a $120,000 asset I'd spent 31 years building, that they were mine before she moved in, and that our engagement had not transferred ownership of my personal property to her. She said fine in the tone that means anything but fine and walked out. That night I did something I'm genuinely glad I did. I went into the collection room and photographed every single book. I pulled all the CGC certification documentation. I emailed everything, photos, appraisals, insurance records, cert numbers to myself and to my attorney, a guy I'd used for my townhouse closing. Then I had him draft a formal written notice, printed 2 copies, and handed one to her the next morning. It stated clearly that the comic book collection was my sole personal property, that I had not consented to its sale or removal, and that any unauthorized disposal would result in immediate legal action, including criminal charges for theft. She looked at it and said I was being insane. I asked her to sign the second copy acknowledging receipt. She didn't sign it. She put it on the kitchen counter like it was a takeout menu. Didn't matter. The time-stamped email to my attorney already documented that the notice existed and had been delivered. 4 days later, I came home from work, and the room was empty. Not partially empty. Not mostly empty. Completely empty. Climate control still humming. UV frames still on the walls. Every single book, every CGC slab, every Mylar sleeve gone. I stood in the doorway for about 30 seconds without moving. Then I called her. She answered on the second ring and told me the dealer had picked everything up that morning, that she was getting $67,000 wired to her account by end of week, and that I'd thank her when we were in a real house. She actually said I'd thank her for selling $120,000 worth of my property without my consent for $67,000, a catastrophic lowball she'd accepted just to move fast, and depositing the money into her personal account. I hung up, called my attorney, then called the police. The responding officer was skeptical at first, which I understood. Fiancée sold your stuff doesn't immediately read as grand theft. But I had everything. The written notice, the time-stamped email chain, the full appraisal, the insurance documentation, the CGC cert numbers, photos of every book. The officer's expression changed when he saw the appraisal figure. I gave him the dealer's business card, which she'd left sitting on my kitchen counter, either sloppy or arrogant, and in my experience those are basically the same thing. Here's where her plan fell apart in a way she really hadn't thought through. The dealer had already contacted me. Not out of guilt, out of due diligence. He was trying to authenticate the Action Comics #1, and when he ran the CGC certification number, it triggered an alert through a security feature I'd registered years ago that flagged my contact information for exactly this kind of scenario. The alert hit my email 40 minutes after she'd called me to announce the sale. He hadn't known the collection was stolen. He'd paid $67,000 for books worth more than twice that, and now he was holding stolen property and wanted no part of it. He told me he hadn't moved anything and was waiting to cooperate with whoever I sent his direction. The police contacted him that evening. He cooperated fully. The local felony theft charge was filed within 48 hours. In our state, theft of property valued over $100,000 is first-degree theft, which carries up to 10 years. But it got more complicated than that, and this is where her father's dinner table smirk really came back to haunt the family. The dealer shop was across a state line. She had facilitated the transport of property she didn't own across state lines, with documented prior notice of the ownership dispute. My attorney flagged this to the detective, who escalated to the FBI's Property Crime Division. Under the National Stolen Property Act, interstate transport of stolen goods valued over $5,000 is a federal offense. The FBI opened a case at the 3-week mark. While all of that was developing, I got to watch the entitlement machine run at full power. First came the charm offensive. She showed up at my door 2 days after her arrest, out on bail, completely composed, like she'd rehearsed, and told me this was a misunderstanding and that if I dropped the charges we could move forward. She used the phrase "move forward" about my fiancé selling 6 figures of my property without consent and pocketing the money. I told her the engagement was over and that she needed to remove her belongings from my home. She switched tactics immediately and told me her father knew people, attorneys, judges, and that he could make things very difficult for me. Then introduce them to my attorney, I said. Tell him to bring everyone he knows. Her father did try. His civil attorney sent a letter arguing that because we were engaged and living together, there was an implied joint ownership of household assets. It was creative. My attorney's response letter destroyed it in 3 paragraphs. No domestic partnership agreement, no joint accounts, no coming-led property, no marriage, and most importantly, a dated written notice asserting my sole ownership that she had received and acknowledged before the sale occurred. The implied joint ownership argument requires the absence of an explicit ownership claim. Mine was documented, time-stamped, and witnessed. The civil gambit died immediately. Then her father tried something genuinely reckless. He approached the dealer directly and offered to pay back the $67,000 so the dealer would withdraw his cooperation and claim he'd purchased everything legitimately. He apparently believed this would sever the theft chain entirely. The dealer recorded the conversation and gave it to the FBI. That recording added an obstruction of justice angle to the federal investigation that now had her father directly in its scope. The man who'd sat across my dinner table writing off my life's work as a real estate down payment was now looking at a potential federal obstruction charge for trying to buy his way out of his daughter's criminal case. They weren't done, though. She filed a civil harassment complaint against me claiming my cooperation with law enforcement was targeted retaliation. Her new attorney, more aggressive, hired by her father, sent letters to my employer suggesting I was unstable and had fabricated the theft allegation. They were hoping to get me fired, shake my finances, and pressure me into backing down. My employer called me in, showed me the letter, and asked if I needed HR support. I showed them my documentation. They told me to take whatever time I needed. The harassment complaint was dismissed. The letters to my employer were later cited in my civil countersuit as evidence of a coordinated intimidation campaign. The federal and state cases ran on separate timelines, which is how it works. By month 4, she accepted a plea on the state felony theft charge. The agreement included restitution, 3 years supervised probation, and a permanent felony conviction on her record. The prosecution wasn't interested in waiving the conviction regardless of what her attorney negotiated. The restitution figure was set at $141,000, the current appraised value at time of sentencing, not the original $120,000, because the collection had appreciated during the months it was tied up as evidence. She didn't have $141,000. Her father, now managing his own federal exposure, was considerably less eager to write checks on her behalf. The restitution was structured as a civil judgment attached to the criminal case, running against her wages and assets going forward with interest. Her father's obstruction matter resolved separately. He retained a federal defense attorney and negotiated a deferred prosecution agreement, meaning no formal charge filed if he stayed clean for 2 years. But it cost him enormously in legal fees, and a federal investigation of a commercial real estate investor generates scrutiny in places investors desperately don't want scrutinized. 2 of his pending development deals collapsed when partners quietly withdrew after the investigation became known in their circles. The books were recovered, completely intact. The dealer had stored everything properly. My Action Comics number 1, Detective Comics number 27, Amazing Fantasy number 15, all of it sitting in his back room exactly as it had left mine. After the evidentiary hold cleared, everything was returned to me. I had it all reappraised immediately, $141,000. The market had been kind while all of this played out. My civil countersuit, filed separately from the criminal restitution, targeted the documented intimidation campaign against my employer and covered attorney's fees. 11 months after the original incident, we settled. The terms are confidential, but my legal fees were covered, and then some. I want to be clear about something for anyone reading this who thinks I went too far. She didn't act impulsively. She contacted a dealer in advance. She coordinated a pickup time. She received written legal notice from an attorney and proceeded anyway. She had the wire transfer routed to her personal account. Every step was a deliberate choice. And when consequences arrived, she and her father ran a coordinated multi-front campaign to intimidate me into silence. Fake civil complaints, letters to my employer, witness tampering. People who do that aren't making mistakes. They're making calculations. The only thing that changes the calculation is consequences severe enough to matter. The collection is back in the second bedroom. Climate control recalibrated. Every CGC slab back in its UV frame. I had a biometric lock installed on that room the week the books came home, fingerprint entry mine only. Action Comics number 1 is on the wall. Superman punching a car on the cover, exactly as he's been doing since 1938. The book survived all of it without a grade change. Her father sent me one email about 8 months after everything closed. He said he hoped I was satisfied with what I'd done to his family and that some things weren't worth the cost.
I didn't respond, but I did think about it.
He's right that some things aren't worth the cost. Specifically, some things aren't worth the cost of stealing them. If she'd want a real conversation about the room, the collection, our future together, I was available for that. I'm a reasonable person. There might have been solutions. But she didn't want a conversation. She wanted me to fold. I didn't fold. The felony conviction is in the state record. The restitution judgment runs against her wages. Her father's deferred prosecution agreement sits in a federal prosecutor's drawer. The collection is home, appraised higher than it's ever been, behind a door that only opens for me. If you made it this far, hit subscribe because honestly, knowing your rights before someone tests them is exactly the kind of thing this community exists.